I didn't have a plan, but something about the advice he gave me, I just knew in my bones, this is wrong. So I quit. And he said, you're going to have a tough time finding a job. And I said, I'm going to have another job in 24 hours.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Mitchell Earl. Mitchell is the COO of Praxis, the college alternative program that I used to work for. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've probably heard me talk about Praxis. Mitchell went through one of the original cohorts of the program, which is how I first met him. And he spent years working in the startup world, building a career at multiple different companies before eventually taking over at Praxis as the COO. And in today's episode, Mitchell and I talk about the college question. We talk about whether or not it's important for a young person to go to college to start their career, and wherever you land on that question, how that affects how you think about everything else in your child's education. We talk about how to think philosophically about your career and your life trajectory, not just your own life, but the trajectory of the lives of your children and your grandchildren, and the difference between long-term and short-term thinking, and how shifting those lenses changes everything about the philosophy you hold and the decisions that you make. And we talk a lot about how to think about building a startup career, and some of the biggest lessons that Mitchell learned along the way as a 20-something working in a fast-paced startup, and how those lessons have impacted how he thinks about his career now, and also the program that he's building to help young people find their way in the world, figure out what they want to do with their lives, and be successful in whatever arena they choose. I always really enjoy talking to Mitchell, and he and I hadn't had a chance to catch up in a while, so this was a really fun conversation, and I hope you enjoy listening. Mitchell Earl, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, Hannah, thanks for having me here.
I know it's been a while. I'm selfishly very excited to catch up because you and I used to work together very closely, and it's been a minute. The cadence of catch-ups has slowed significantly.
Well, you've been busy, so.
So have you.
Yeah.
You had a whole kid.
Yeah, a whole kid. Seriously, my wife and I look at our kid all the time, and it's like, we made this. It's crazy.
Yeah. We've caught up since you've become a dad, but I don't think we've ever stopped and really talked about the experience of being a father. I feel like the biggest glimpses I've gotten have been the things that you've written about and posted. But I selfishly just want to talk about this for a second, because you're a very philosophical person.
Yeah. And
so I appreciate your philosophical musings on the things that are happening in your life. Talk to me about being a dad. I feel like this must change everything about how you look at the world.
Man. Well, people say that, oh my gosh, becoming a parent changes everything. And you think you understand what they mean, even when you find out you're pregnant, when you find out your wife's pregnant, in this case, you think you know what it means. And you think as you get closer and closer to that you can anticipate the ways that your life is going to change. For me, and I think this is likely a common thing for men in particular, you go into this different gear, even before the kid shows up. You're like, I'm not just a guy anymore. I'm not just a husband. I'm now beginning to accept this mantle as provider. And it's hard to explain the mental aspect of that. It really is, because I thought that I was intellectually prepared for that, but the shift happens almost right before your eyes. And you start thinking on a different time horizon almost immediately. It's no longer, not just days and weeks. Not just do I like my career? Do I like where we live? Do I like, my life? And all these different pillars of your life. You start thinking about we've got this other life we're responsible for, and how do I make sure that this kid has the best life? And what are the things that I need to be doing in my own life to do that? And what do my wife and I need to be doing as a team to do that? And it changes your perspective first, and then the kid shows up and you're like, oh my gosh, it disrupts everything. And it disrupts everything in a very challenging way at first, because you're so worked up, and then suddenly you're sleep deprived, and you're also learning. I assume the second one's a little bit easier on the learning curve front, but you're you're suddenly just held hostage to this new big responsibility of it's not a dog, it's not a pet, it's not like low stakes. Like I've got to keep this kid alive. And even more than that, like I want to make sure that things I'm doing are setting this kid up for success. And you're scared about all these things in a way that you weren't before. And I think beyond the visceral part of being a father, like day to day, you're also, it forces, it's this beautiful forcing function in your life where you have to be suddenly so much more deliberate about everything, about how you spend your time, when you're going to do things that are important to you, when you're going to fit them in. And there's always trade-offs now in a way that there weren't. You can't just run to the grocery store. You now like got to schedule things in. You can't just read a book you're interested in. You can't just develop a skill. You can't just fly across the country to have a meeting. Like you've got to be very deliberate about everything. And it forces you to up your game. And that's one of those things that it's so frustrating at first, but then you're like, this is a superpower. It's something that I've been given this awesome gift, not just this, this tiny, beautiful little human in front of me that's bringing me so much joy, but this gift to suddenly re-examine every part of my life and make sure that I am being deliberate. And that's been one of the awesome rewards of it.
I think I'm curious to hear your perspective on, I find it interesting to hear your perspective on the shift in framework. And I think there's a piece of this that I think catches a lot of people. And I see this a lot being in Austin, in a city full of young professionals who are highly ambitious. Many of them delay marriage and children, sometimes significantly. And it's just, there's this cultural phenomenon of being really afraid of having kids, or not even sure you want to commit to it, but being like very afraid of how it's going to impact the trajectory of the rest of your life. It feels like this huge sacrifice. You're giving up all of this freedom. And it manifests in different ways in different places geographically, but Austin's a very good place. If you want to see this phenomenon in action, hang out in Austin. Actually, it's probably, I'm sure it's worse in like LA and New York and cities where people are even more career focused. I think people come here who are a little more, perhaps have more traditional values, and they are looking to settle down and have kids, but you still see this tug back and forth in people's psyches of like, people are afraid of the responsibility of it. And when you and I worked together, and when I first got to know you, when we both lived in Charleston, South Carolina, you like were the young professional who was like, you were the single guy who was
10 lifetimes ago now.
But you were the single guy. You were like hustling in your startup jobs. You were working like at a couple different startups in Charleston, and you were, grinding and building a career and hanging out with your friends and like, living the lifestyle that I think a lot of people are afraid to give up.
Yeah.
And you've completely pivoted that now. Obviously, you're living in small town America, raising a kid.
Yep.
How has that like shifted your perspective on, I don't exactly know what my question is, but I'm curious to hear you drill into this a little bit because it's such a prevalent phenomenon. And I feel like it's an important subpoint to a lot of what I talk about with education. Like I care about the actual raising of the children, but I also care about the having of the children. That's important too. And it's, the more you dig into raising kids, the less scary I feel like it gets, at least for me. But I feel like a lot of people don't think about it enough. They just think about what they're giving up, not what they're gaining, or not how they balance what they're becoming with the things that they don't want to lose.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things, so many aspects of parenthood that are scary and downright intimidating before you even think about this. I think even, there are so many points in my career. I can distinctly look back at points in my career where probably because I was like adrift in life, like trying to find my big purpose in life. And, I was very career oriented and working long hours. And there were times I thought I was never going to get married. I was just going to work and I'd be like a career person. And there were times where I was like, I'm never going to have kids. And it's so funny to look back at that and laugh and be like, I just didn't even know. I didn't know anything. And I know even less now. And I'm not afraid to admit it. But I think today, especially among our generation, there's so many things that are scary about it. I think it's another part of the cultural moment right now where people are also just terrified about the world that we live in. And that sort of adds to this fear about having kids. And I experienced my own version of this very briefly, where it's a terrible feeling. You almost feel guilty for thinking this the second after it happens. And it's like, what have I done? Like, look at how much bad stuff's happening in the world. Like, am I doing the right thing bringing a kid into this world? And then you're like, you know what? That's such a nasty, pessimistic, like loser mentality. Like we have to be hopeful. We have to be optimistic that the future is going to be better. And especially as parents, like if you're not hopeful that the future is going to be better, your job is already tremendously, it's already tremendously difficult enough as it is. And it only gets harder. You only make it harder on yourself. And like, I've been a parent for 10 months. So like, I don't know anything about this at all. Like I'm very much new to it all and learning, but I've got to appreciate all the ways that it's changed my mind and perspective, and especially contrasted against younger versions of myself. I think you made a good point. There's at different points in your trajectory when you're very career focused. Maybe if you don't know what it's all for, that was a big theme in my early 20s and mid 20s is I don't know what it's all for. I know I'm just very ambitious, and I'm going to aim as high as I possibly can, and I'm going to run as fast as I can. I'm going to work as hard as I can, and like I know it's going to pay off, and I have no idea what that's going to look like. Like I'll make money, I'll work on cool things, I'll get to meet interesting people, and this goes back to what I was alluding to about time horizon. Is so much of my time horizon in my 20s was here and now. It was 6 months at a time, 12 months at a time, or even like this quarter, what are OKRs for this quarter? And as I started to, change my mind, I guess I wouldn't say met my wife's not the term because we met each other in junior high, but as we kind of like went down that path and got rekindled and I knew that I was going to marry my wife, that was this like shift in time horizon of like, it was a linear shift. It was like, here I am thinking about life in terms of like months and quarters. And now it's thinking about, years, but not like lifetime. You get married and you think about lifetime, but you're not really thinking about, 40 or 50 years in the future, the way that you suddenly begin to when kids enter the equation. Your time horizon extends even further. And as I started trying to mentally prepare myself for kids, it wasn't just who I'm going to be as their parent in a few years or who I'm going to be as an old person with my kids as adults, but it shifted even further. And this is something I didn't expect as you start thinking about the transition of values and ideas and legacy and like these things that are important to hand down past generations. And that's been something that's been weighing heavy on me the past few years in particular. And I think this plays into a lot of the ideas about education too. And kind of these fears about the world we live in is like, what are the things that we need to be handing down to our kids to make sure that like the world is better off tomorrow than it is today? And I don't have a perfect answer to all those things. I have, the beginnings of like, the beginnings of a bunch of different ideas that I've been exploring and themes that have been evolving as I've explored that question more and tried to think about not just the ideas, but like, what does that actually mean as I'm raising this kid? Like, what are the things we need to be doing? What are the conversations we need to be having? Are we going to homeschool? Are we going to send them to, send our kid to traditional school? Are we going to do something else? Am I going to start a school? Like you have all these different pathways that emerge and attempting to be thoughtful about those things. You at least try to boil them down and like, what does that actually mean actionably? But the big surprising thing is that like, these are the things that I'm even thinking about now compared to where I was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even, 5 or 6 years ago in my career. It's a humbling shift, especially in your early 20s. I think if we were to map it out on a curve and like your level of confidence about how much you know about the world over time, it's like you go from a young age and it's low, and then you get into your teen years and it starts to increase, and then you get into your early 20s and it gets up here, and then like, I don't know, as I started to exit my 20s and into my 30s, it started to plummet. And it's like, I don't know anything. And I'm now in like beginning to embrace defeat and beginning to admit humility about all the things I don't know about, and how the more that I learn and the more that I try to figure out these things, that I'm left more with questions, but more questions than answers, and more, especially in the context of being a parent. Like, there's so many things you don't know, but I think the biggest difference now between my 20s is you do it because you want to. You do it because you enjoy life. And it's not because you're like working to fill some void. It's not because you don't have a vision of where you want to go. It's not just because you want to, work as hard as you can and run as fast as you can and work on cool stuff. It's like, I love my life. I like the people that are in it. I like the problems that I get to work on. And you feel this sense, especially this is the biggest probably shift in entering parenthood as well, is you begin to feel this sense of gratitude in a way that you never felt in your life before. And that becomes like this, it gels the foundation of everything else. And I don't think that I felt that or appreciated that enough when I was in my 20s.
The point that you made about the shifting time horizons and how you think about life is, I think, really important. And also, I don't know if it's unappreciated across the board because, we're two relatively young people having a conversation about these things. I think we'd probably have a very different conversation about it in a couple decades, obviously. But I feel like in at least the circles of like younger people who are trying to figure out their life trajectories, and then I think in to some extent in the like intellectual class too, the people who are more philosophical, sort of driving the conversations that we're having on a cultural level, I don't think that that's appreciated as much as it should be. This dramatic shift between really short-term thinking to mid-term thinking and then to like truly long-term generational thinking. And I think it's really problematic for a lot of reasons. And I think you see the effects of it everywhere from how we make decisions about our day-to-day lives all the way through to like how we educate our kids and how we even think about structuring a family and how we think about our careers and like what are we working towards? Are we trying to leave specific things behind? If we are, what are they? Is it intellectual ideas? Is it knowledge? Is it wealth? Is it opportunity? Is it network? Is it land? Is it something else? Bitcoin? Like what are we trying to leave behind? And I think I find it really interesting that because I've noticed this shift too, and I don't know if this is because I grew up homeschooled and I just had like a weird mindset to begin with, or like I don't really know where this came from, but I feel like we've talked about this before, that early in my 20s, I think like even at 18, 19, I just decided that I knew I wanted to have kids someday, and as a woman that was going to make careers harder because there's just more that you have to balance.
Tougher. It's way tougher.
And so I just decided from the onset that everything I was thinking about in my career was built around the idea that by the time I was 30, I didn't want to have to be working full-time hours, and I wanted to be able to do cool stuff that I really cared about in small amounts of hours so I could still scratch the intellectual itch that I had to build things. But I knew I was building towards being a mother someday. Yeah. And that was like a type of long-term thinking that I didn't really, like I never really talked to people who also were thinking that way. It didn't seem, or when you look up career advice on the internet, it just wasn't commonplace to find people saying, oh, if you want to be a homeschooling mom someday, here's how to think about your career. There wasn't one because nobody was talking about it. So I feel like even in that, my thinking was extended in a way that wasn't always encouraged by most people. And there certainly weren't templates for. But I think, we live in this world where a lot of the intellectual class doesn't have kids, or they don't have many kids, and they're not interested in having kids, certainly not big families. Yeah. And so even the language we use to think about the world, like it's a kind of a radical idea when you start thinking about what if you thought in terms of generations? Like what if you thought about legacy? Yeah. What if you thought about the work that you're doing as setting up your grandkids and your great grandkids, not just to have like a solid economic foundation, like let's build generational wealth, but like let's build like generational ideas and generational values and generational philosophy around not just how we think about the world around us, but how we do life. Like it's weird that that's as interesting a concept. Like that shouldn't be interesting because it should just be a thing that we all think about. Yeah. But it's interesting because you don't hear people talk about it very much. And I think I've heard a lot of people say what you just said, that you have a kid and then your thinking just expands dramatically. And I feel like I've been exposed to that way more than is commonplace for a 27-year-old who doesn't yet have kids, because of the work that I do and the conversations that I have, it's a thing I'm very aware of as a phenomenon, even though I haven't yet experienced it as like, in the embodied way of like, I philosophically get it, but I haven't experienced the shift in the space-time continuum that I am told occurs when you have a baby. But I just think that is such an important set of questions to ask. Like, I talk to parents a lot when I'm talking about education, and they're trying to decide, what are we going to do with our 3-year-old? Like, are we even going to think about preschool? Are we going to send them to kindergarten? Do we not care until they're 8? And it's like, okay, well, maybe we should make sure that our kid can read if they haven't picked it up along the way yet. There's such a spectrum of how you can think about this. And I think you kind of have to talk about the college question from the onset, not because most people, when they say that, they mean which college prep preschool are you going to send your child to, which is ridiculous. But you have to think about it sort of from the inverse perspective of, do you even care? Because if you don't care about what your kid's doing when they're 18, if you're not going to be disappointed with them if they don't get into Harvard, if you don't think that's even important, then most of what we think is important when your kid is 6 also doesn't apply anymore, because it's all structured on a continuum where the anchor point is college. And so you start thinking, your thinking expands when you take the long-term time horizon perspective of, okay, in 2 decades, what do I want for my kid? Okay, now, what the neighbors are doing for kindergarten, whether or not my kid gets into this good charter school that everybody else is getting to, suddenly doesn't even feel important because it has no bearing on that long-term goal that actually is relevant. And I think, so I think it's really important to take that long-term time horizon perspective, really from the beginning with everything. But that shift that you're describing, that you're experiencing now, I think you have to take that philosophical, long-term lens, not even with what do I want my kid doing in 2 decades, but what is the philosophical legacy that we want to be building, the way that we see the world.
Yeah.
And then what are all the second and third order effects of that? But also once you've set that as a goal, what are the second and third order benefit or areas that this impacts that also start to shift?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I think are worth unpacking there. So you make a good point, I think. So let's start with college. This is one we can go on a rabbit trail with, but I think you'll appreciate this thinking. So in the context of college, especially when you think about elite colleges, which maybe there's a separate argument, an entire podcast to be made about whether that's even a worthwhile goal in the world that we live in today and what higher education has become. But it's very true today that if you are not planning for Harvard as a young kid, every year that you wait to start planning for Harvard, you are decreasing your likelihood of success. You can't start planning for Harvard at age 17 and have a good shot at getting in. Now, is that a worthwhile goal? Separate issue. But here's a problem that I've encountered that, again, I've got a 10-month-old. This is so far out of my realm as a parent, but I'll speak, it's my work, is what we do at Praxis. And having spoken with thousands of young adults, parents, and even parents who are farther ahead of me in this journey about what they've done and their perspective is, I think a very common problem that we see in the world today is that people do take a long-term time horizon when it comes to their kid, but their time horizon isn't long enough. They anchor it at a point like college. I want my kid to be at a certain level, and the way that I'm going to measure that is this extrinsic thing of where they got into college. And I'm thinking about them at age 18, but the thinking stops there. It's not who my kid is at 22 as a person. It's not who they are at 25, who they are at 30, who they are as a parent, when they have kids. And that's part of the issue, because it's very linear. It's very linear thinking. It's very one track or outcome focused, which I think is a big problem, not just in parenting as I'm learning, but also in education. But if you focus everything on this one specific outcome, you're preparing yourself to be let down. Something that I think about this long and hard a lot, in the present moment and over the past year as we've been preparing to be parents is, I like to have my life in perfect order. I'm very controlling over the things that I have dominion over. Like, I'm very conscientious. I like to be in control of my calendar. I like my inbox to be at 0. I like to like have perfect order. And I knew that having a kid was going to disrupt that. And I think part of the like, what's the like byproduct of that, if I'm as domineering as I am in other areas of my life as a parent, is that like it's going to lead to a bad outcome. You can't just be a helicopter parent. And I know this, like, I think we all know this, even helicopter parents, in theory, like, know this, like, you can't just suffocate your kids. And then I think plenty of people still do it. If you want your kid to thrive, you got to let go of the reins. And that's terrifying. It terrifies me. I know that there's some struggle that I'm going to have in years as my kid, tries to go out and encounter the world. And I'm going to want to like not let her fall off her bicycle and scrape her knees. And I'm going to want to protect her from all these things. I think that plays into the idea of college and education and the experiences that you're exposing them to. And even the big question that I think my wife and I are, we're trying to think this through too, as both working professionals of like, what do we do for school ourselves? It's one that you begin to think about the consequences of your choices played out over time. And, when it comes to education right now, I know you talk to a lot of people that are in the homeschool space, alternative education space. And I think that we all have this hypotheses about what education is supposed to be out of the box, because this is the way that it's been and maybe not for you, because you were fortunately homeschooled. So you were raised outside of the system, and you were already like a free thinker in this. But for, like, I grew up in the public school system. My mom was a teacher. My sister was a teacher at one point in time. My sister-in-law was a teacher. My aunt was two of my aunts were a teacher. 3 of my aunts were a teacher. However many, like so many teachers in my life. And I think that public school and like kind of the traditional path is just all I knew growing up. And I think that today in the landscape that we live in, I think you have to be okay with not having really high confidence that you have a perfect system figured out for preparing your kid to be better than you were. And that's that plays into this idea of legacy and like passing values down. Is like, you're going to mess it up. You're going to make a ton of mistakes. I think that a lot of people think that they can outsource their responsibility to systems that have been around for a long time. And because those systems have been around for a long time, they're supposed to work, and they're supposed to have a really nice, shiny, good-looking outcome. And that by outsourcing that responsibility, you're doing the best thing you can for your family. And I think that, again, you asked about time horizon. I think that for a lot of people, that time horizon ends at 18. It's on the other side of this. I'm going to have a kid that got into a good college, but I don't think about like, what does that mean for them getting into a good college? Are they going to be happy? Are they going to be like running after the thing they're most excited by? Are they going to be equipped to do that? Are they even going to know how to go chase the thing that they want to chase? Are they even going to know what they're interested in? I don't know. Those are the things that keep me up at night right now. And I think that in terms of, I open this up by saying I have more questions than answers now, but those are very much the questions that I've been wrestling with as a new parent, and thinking about like, the choices you make and how they impact, how they play out over time.
I want to talk a little bit about your journey with all of this, because you just mentioned that you come from a family of many school teachers.
Yeah.
And I know that you had we've talked about this before. I know you have a whole journey with slowly shifting your perspective on what's important in education. And when I say education, I think in large part, in context of this conversation at least, I mean like preparation for life. And there are a couple of reasons why I'm really excited to talk to you about all of this, because I think like, one, you just have such a cool story of coming from a very traditional background and then getting into the startup world and like very aggressively growing your way through the startup world. And you've worked on some really cool projects, and you've been very philosophical about each step of the process, and you did a great job documenting all of it, like writing about it along the way. So I knew you too, but I also got to read the things that you were writing as you were thinking through each step of the process. But I think so much of what's important in an education is the practical side of things of,
Yeah.
what are you preparing yourself, or are you preparing your child, depending on who's in the driver's seat and like what stage of education we're talking about. Is preparation occurring to be able to go out into the world and actually do things of value? Like things that you can translate over to things that you can convert into monetary gains. Like can you make a living doing
Yep.
the things that you're learning about? And so I'm really like we'll go down some rabbit holes, I think, as we go about how to think about, especially like through an entrepreneurial lens. And I don't mean like starting a business entrepreneurial. I mean thinking with an entrepreneurial spirit about a career.
Yeah.
And being a value. There's so many different ways that can express being a value as a right-hand person, or a teammate of an actual entrepreneur, thinking entrepreneurially inside of a big company. There's lots of different ways that this can apply. But we'll go down the rabbit hole in a little bit of like kind of how to think along those lines. I think you're really good at it. And I think you describe very well the process of getting there. But I'm curious more about your story of, you went to traditional school, you went to traditional college, you were on a very traditional trajectory, and then somehow you ended up going and working for a company, Praxis, but you went through the program and then you ended up working there. That was, completely, like, it was the antithesis of the system.
Yeah, to say the least.
And I want to talk a little bit about what that process was like, because I think a lot of people who are parents themselves who are pulling their kids out of the system, or they're, young people who are on a professional path and are like slowly unlearning, or what I call deschooling themselves from all the things that they learned along the way about how the system's supposed to work. I think a lot of people relate to that shift in paradigm, but
Yep.
It's a messy thing to walk through. What did it look like for you?
It's very messy. I mean, by all accounts, I'm a failure. If I were to measure my station in life today by the goals that I had as a 6-year-old kid, or the expectations I felt that people had of me as an adolescent to teenager to young adult, I was on a very elite academic, like traditional path. I wasn't just a good student. I was a great student. I loved school, which is weird because, now I have plenty of issues, more issues than we'll get into today, but I'm sure you've covered in plenty of podcasts. There are a lot of recurring themes. So plenty of issues with the idea of school and the way that it's manifest today. But part of this was I loved learning. That's something just like, I was always a curious kid. I would love to learn. I love to read. My mom would drop me off at the library during the summers, and I would just read, and I'd read. And I got it in my mind at a very young age that I wanted to be a pediatric neurosurgeon. It was like the most outlandish, impressive, prestigious sounding thing that you could. And I knew that they made a lot of money. And I knew, like, I didn't really understand money, but it's like I knew I want to make a lot of money. I knew I want freedom. I knew I wanted to be able to do whatever I wanted, and didn't really know what that meant. But part of it was tied to this ill-conceived notion about the sort of what the pinnacle of learning looks like. It's like, this is a really hard thing to do, and it's very prestigious, and it's something that only a select few people who do the very best in school get to do. And so kind of had this very elite target that I was aiming at from a young age. And, I tried to get through school as quickly as I could. My mom, this is the benefit of having a mom who's a school teacher at the school you go to, is I got to advance through mathematics and several other things. Like, I got to kind of go at my own pace, even though, part of the school system is designed to like regress everyone to the mean. And I was like spinning my wheels by the time I got out of high school. I went to college, I had my pick of colleges. I went to a state school, which was, again, this was a failure by all accounts. I was supposed to go to an Ivy League school or an elite school, but one blessing my parents gave me was this aversion to debt. And even with great scholarships, I was going to be massively in debt, not only to go to an elite school, but I knew I wanted to go to medical school. So it was like, all right, I was starting to run numbers at 17, 18 years old. And I was like, okay, am I really, $1 million of student debt convicted that I want to do this? I don't know. Like, I don't even really know what's out there in the real world. Do I want to spend the next 10 to 15 years doing this? Am I like really certain that I want to do this? I think part of this was like, I was very scared inside. I was very scared that I was going to make the wrong decision. Then I was going to spend the rest of my life regretting it and like paying off this bad decision. And so I went to state school. It took me not very much time at all in college to realize that it was like, this is just more of the same stuff. It's just, it's a different level, and you have like 10% more freedom. And the social life of college was way more interesting to me because, for a lot of reasons, it was the first time in my life where I had like complete agency over my time. I don't think anybody forced me to do a lot of the things outside of school that I did growing up, but I was on this track where you have to do all the extracurriculars. You have to be the elite student on paper. And so, in college that changed because I was doing a lot of things because I just genuinely wanted to do them outside of class. And one of those things was get involved with an early stage media company, which again, at the time it was like, oh, this will look good on my resume. This will help me get into medical school. This will like be this good thing. And I had no idea the way that it was going to change my trajectory and change my ideas about things. It was this really challenging juxtaposition of like entrepreneurial thinking compared to classroom thinking. I was good at tests. I was good at school. I could go in, I could skip all my classes and go to the test and I could do well. And I know that it made my professors so angry, and we'd like butt heads about this, but it'd be like, I passed the test. You got to give me an A. And like, what I didn't realize at the time is that I was like wasting my time playing the wrong game. I should have just like left college. I think that I was so committed to this idea of like prestige and prestige chasing that it was very difficult for me. Like I didn't even know anybody that like college, dropping out of college was like a very negative thing still. I could have never imagined that at that point in my life. And I really wasn't getting a lot out of my college experience. But the thing is like, I lost my way in college when it was like, I'm not going to medical school anymore. I didn't know what I was aiming for. And college ended up being a waste of time. I was like, not just could I have been doing better things, I absolutely could have been, but it was like a net negative because I was in like the worst possible culture to be aimless, and especially aimless and ambitious, because now you're just like, it's just a recipe for disaster. Like you're sheltered from the real world. You're sheltered from real world consequences. You're also in an environment where everybody else is kind of sheltered in this, sheltered thing. So things just spiral out of control, and you like, there's the partying and the like, just all of the like wasteful, the worst possible like waste of your time and energy and like intellectual capacity. And I look back on that time and, I'm a little bit embarrassed, for a lot of different reasons. But one of them is like, it was a time in my life where I lost my love of learning. Like I wasn't just like reaching to become better. I'm thankful though I had this one outlet, which was working at this early stage startup where it was like, oh, the best ideas rise to the top. It's like, if you have a good idea, like you can do it. Like this business is growing. And that was such a refreshing thing to this like rigid environment of school. And as I started to leave college, I realized I want to do this. I don't know what that means. I don't know how to start a business. I don't know what business I would start. I don't know what anybody would pay me to do today other than like be a smart ass. I was willing to work hard. I was well-meaning, but like by the time I graduated college, I just had this like defiant streak that was a mile wide. And because I just felt like the entire time I was there, I was bucking the system. I was trying to win the game without playing the game, or like, bare minimum effort playing the game. It took me several years on the other side of that to realize what a waste of time, energy, potential that was. And I think that plays into like, the work that I do today, and why I care so much about what I do is, in my distant past, I was that 17 to 22-year-old that was wasting energy fighting a system when I could have been investing that time on good experiences, building skills, finding myself, chasing some more noble pursuit that like stretched me to become a better version of myself. I could have been like net positive to the world rather than just, like wasting time, marking time. And I want that for other people. I want that for 17-year-old me, but I obviously can't go back and change that time. But I know that there's plenty of time to save people from that same path where they're just like, they're wasting time And I think there's something really harmful about being in, it's kind of like being in prison, where you're stuck and you don't feel like there's any way for you to reduce the amount of time that you're going to be suffering. And you're just stuck, and it leads to stagnation, and it leads to this deterioration of your imagination. And there's all these negative consequences about that. And that's why, for me and my story and why this is important is it takes several years to reactivate your imagination and reactivate this like kind of fire once you lose it. And that's what I spent, the first few years out of college was like, I felt like I was the Israelites in the desert wandering around. Like I very much was on this quest to try and figure out what it all means again and like try to reignite my love for learning, because I felt like by the time that I left college, it was just mostly snuffed out.
So it was mostly gone when you left college, but you'd had this spark of working for the startup which was an entirely different world from everything that college represented and everything that college was. And that was some foreshadowing of what the next few years of your life were going to look like. How did you start to get that spark back? And how did you, you knew that the system was not serving you by the time you got out of college, but you didn't necessarily know what the correct alternative was or even what the right path was for you. How did you go about answering those questions?
Yeah, they were very tough questions. It was a very tough time in my life too, because everyone in my life at that time told me, "Oh, you want to be an entrepreneur?" Like it's like kind of sarcastic, sarcastic, and it's tongue in cheek when they say that. And they're like, "Well, you need to go get your MBA, or you need to go get a law degree."
Can we talk about this for a second?
Yeah.
I don't think I've heard this side of the story before. All the pushback to being an entrepreneur. Where'd that come from?
I think this was more so from like the academic circle of people. Like I had so many friends. Like I was on this again. Like I left the path of medical school, and the next backup alternative was like the next most impressive thing you can be, I guess. If you're in the academic world,
right.
This is impressive. Is like you can go to business school or you can be an attorney. I think us regular folk now know like, hey, do people really think attorneys are impressive, or do they have like a negative opinion of them? But I wasn't thinking about those things at this time. But college professors and other people I think it was kind of this sarcastic thing, because it's like, oh, you're throwing away your potential. You're supposed to be this like elite academic student. You're supposed to be, and like you really got off track. And you like are throwing your life away. And I think it was this, more on that in my story, more on how that impacted me. But I felt this goes back even to my childhood. This is a recurrent theme. I had such a huge chip on my shoulder. I always felt like an outsider. I was always coming up with these obstacles, whether they were real or manufactured, where people would be a little bit snarky or doubtful of some goal that I had. And I'd be like, I'm going to prove you wrong. You just better sit back and watch. And like, I was also like somewhat spiteful. I think that was part of the fuel of this. But as I was coming out of college, I think it was the same thing. Is I think that I had such a negative relationship with the system of college. And I felt this sense of doubt, or of like, oh, that kid wasted his potential. But I was like, I'm going to do something awesome. I don't know what that is. The problem is you grow up in the academic world and you don't see business as education. You don't see experience out in the real world as learning. You think of education as, I'm going to school, I'm getting another degree, I am doing these lofty educational things, and that's education. And when I say that my love of learning was snuffed out, I conflated the two. I was like, I don't want to go back to school anymore. And, I didn't see these musings on the side as education. I just saw it as like tinkering, as like stuff that I enjoyed doing, like, reading books, reading books that weren't assigned on some college reading list, or something. I wasn't getting a certificate for these things that I just wanted to do on my own. And I had it had almost this negative relationship with learning, because I almost felt guilty for doing it, because there wasn't some specific, like tangible, concrete gold sticker I could put on my resume for it. But getting out into the real world and I launched a freelance photography business around the same time, and then getting my first like handful of jobs right out of school, like all kind of simultaneously, and doing these things and realizing how hard it is to earn money on your own, and like realizing how much of the day to day is problem solving, even in your day to day job. Like one of my first jobs working for a law firm was a small law firm, but so much of the day to day operations of the business were just, it was real world problem solving and learning how to solve a problem, and having to teach yourself something on the fly to solve a problem that the business needed solving. And I didn't see that as education. So in addition to those experiences, I had, I had the good fortune of just encountering a couple of really successful entrepreneurs, mentors, people that I collided with. Some of them were like, I would consider as like direct mentors. Some it was more like observationally, like this is a person that I know of doing something, and something they've said or something I've read that they've done, or just kind of following, their example out in the real world. And it began to make sense to me. Took several years. I wish I would have known this as a teenager, but it took several years in my early 20s to realize like, oh my gosh, they're the same thing. Like learning in the real world, that's actually education. All these facts I memorized in high school to be good at academics, all these like silly things, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, like all these things, like they're useless when I actually use those. How did those make my life better? How did I make money? How did I make how did I make someone else's life better? Because I knew these facts. And I think I don't think it was like an aha epiphany. I think it was just, I began to see these things play out in real life of, oh, there's a problem. Well, what's my best idea on how to solve that? And oh, well, I don't know how to do that thing. Okay, well, I'm going to go spend 30 minutes like researching how to do that. And then like, okay, well, I'm just going to jump in and I'm going to tinker and I'm going to like try. And not because I'm like trying to get an A on the test, but it's like, this is genuinely interesting. I feel like I'm being challenged. I feel like this is intellectually stimulating. And it took several years of that, like that exact process, even from like lowly things like, one of my first career jobs, I look back on like my first 2 weeks I spent, literally first 2 weeks, licking envelopes and stuffing tax forms in envelopes. And it was this like, okay, I know this is going to suck and I'm going to suffer through this. So how can I, how can I minimize my suffering? And so you go into this like problem solving mode. And it was a lot of that for several years that I think rehabilitated this love for learning. And it wasn't just the love for learning. It was this better conceptualization of like what education actually is and what learning actually is and why it's important and why it's something that we should all love and we should all be doing regularly throughout our lives.
Today's episode is brought to you by the John Galt Mortgage Company. I am not currently in the market for a house, but when I am, I will absolutely be working with the John Galt Mortgage Company, which was started by my friends Mitch and Tim earlier this year. Mitch and Tim have been working in the real estate world for years, and they realized over time that mortgages are way more expensive than they need to be. Most real estate agents don't even realize how much extra profit is baked into the cost. So Mitch and Tim decided to build a new kind of mortgage, one where they voluntarily cap their own profit on every transaction and pass the savings along to you, the buyer, in the form of a lower interest rate. When I'm buying a house, I will absolutely be working with them. And if you're in the market for a house, you should too. You can find more about what they're doing at johngaltmortgage.com, or you can find a link to their site down in the show notes. Okay, back to the show.
I talk a lot on Twitter about the idea of deschooling because one, I think is really important, but two, it really resonates for people more than I would have thought it would. Like when I started talking about deschooling, I didn't know if it was actually gonna, like sometimes you say stuff and it makes sense to you, but it doesn't necessarily intuitively hit for other people. But this one does, which I find fascinating. But when I'm talking about deschooling, I'm talking about, because, there's homeschooling, there's unschooling, and unschooling is just like, a very anarchistic approach to homeschooling where you kind of let your kids do whatever you want. Deschooling is the active undoing of the damage done by school. So your kids go to school, or you went to school and you learn all these assumptions about how the world works, like the John Taylor Gatto style. Yep. You have to listen to an authority figure and live by the bell, and your self-esteem is tied to your test scores and like all of these very insidious things that you pick up when you're in school. And so deschooling is the active process of undoing that and rewiring some of these assumptions about how the world works that you picked up when you were in the classroom, and then you go out in the real world and you're like, wait a second, this is not actually relevant at all. I don't know how easy it is to pinpoint, but I'm really curious what some of the biggest things are when you think about it through the lens of deschooling. What are some of the things you had to unlearn again to make learning fun? Like, is there a specific list of assumptions that you had to actively rewire? You were conscious that they were being rewired that started to make learning fun, but also learning through doing business a very appealing thing instead of something where you're like, ugh, okay, I guess I have to learn this thing now.
You have a lot of thoughts on that. Somewhat scattered, but I think, to use an off-the-cuff metaphor here, at some point I realized schooling is like a standardized test, but real life is like algebra. There are problems and there are variables, and there are a lot of different ways to solve that same problem. There's not one specific right answer. There's, and in many cases, there aren't even a perfect right answer. There are multiple different ways to arrive at a solution. And when I think about deschooling, or that process of, I use the word rehabilitated, I think that's the best conceptualization that I can come up with, is truly like rehabilitating this love for learning is the value of interest-driven development or interest-driven pursuits, or following your curiosity rather than doing something because you feel like you have to. There have been various points in my career where I've like had to learn something, and like it was, I did it because I had to do it. That's a very short list of times. Vast majority of times that I had to learn something in the real world, it was because I really wanted to, and it also happens to solve the problem, or happens to make me more valuable at work. And they're silly ones too. They're ones where I like had a very specific objective. I liked technology, I liked math, I liked business, all these things coming out of the real world, but I don't even know how many different exposures to Microsoft Excel in college in different classes, and I understood how it worked at a very, very like surface level coming out of college. But it wasn't until some of those early jobs and working at a law firm, running all of the billing and invoicing and collections and all of that, and then doing that for another small business, and then working at a startup where I was cleaning data, and it was a brutal job, and I was doing that literally one cell at a time, and teaching myself how to become a master at Excel. And that's one specific example of, a skill that I learned, but it wasn't because I decided to take this college class of let's master Excel and I'm going to get a gold star on my resume. It's like, I really hate sitting here doing this by hand. And this is really interesting. Oh my gosh, you could make this, look how much time I can save if I can learn how to do this thing. And it was that process repeated over and over and over again, of applied to one specific scenario in my day job, and then another one, and then another one. And you begin to accumulate these skills, and then you learn as you master some of these different skills. Oh, these skills overlap, and these skills coupled together, they're even more valuable. And you do that over and over and over again. And as you do it, you're like, this is really fun. What are some other things that I can add into the mix to make myself even better at what I do, or to make myself, not just more impressive? That's really not it. You stop thinking about that. And it's more of, how can I reclaim more of my time? How can I get better at what I do, so that, I can stop working, spending tons of time on first drafts. Instead, I'm spitting out like high quality work the first try on everything that I'm doing. And it becomes this, for somebody like me, it's becomes something you get obsessed by. You become a little bit obsessed by like learning how to do everything that you're interested in, and not just because you're supposed to, but because you truly are curious. You truly want to learn. You truly want to know how things work underneath the hood. And that took years and years and years, I think, for me to realize, like, to rehabilitate that relationship with learning. And now I love it. Like, I've always been a reader, but there was I was reinvigorated in my mid-20s as I started to like repair and rehabilitate that relationship with learning, not because I have to, but because I get to, but because I can, because it's fun. because it's an end unto itself.
You mentioned as part of the story how all this relates to the work that you do now, which I think is important context for everything else we're going to talk about for the rest of this conversation.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what you do for work?
Yeah. Our company Praxis helps young adults figure out what they want to do, build the skills they need, and then go do it, like actually go accomplish it. Most of them, they do that without college, and they save a ton of time. They save a ton of money, but more important than the actual practical value of the program is they gain confidence, they gain clarity, and they develop a roadmap for their futures, a positive vision for their futures. And that's something that I was, I lost that positive vision, and that sort of underpins everything. Is if you kind of know what you're aiming for, even if it's somewhat vague and you don't have a perfect crystallized version of that, you kind of know, hey, there's this thing on the horizon. That's where I'm headed. Kind of makes the whole pursuit worth it. It makes it worthwhile. It makes all the suffering that you're going to endure as you learn new things and you encounter new obstacles worthwhile. And that's something that I think is grossly underestimated when people think about higher education, is the importance of equipping young adults with a positive vision for their lives. That's probably the most remarkable thing that our program does. And this isn't a pat myself on the back or anything like this. This is a part of the magic of the program and the community, and intentionally building cohorts of students that all share the right raw materials. And you have this camaraderie where students who are all excited and ambitious, and they like to learn, and they're curious, and they're shoulder to shoulder, and they're working on hard things, and they're trying to figure it out. And it's contagious. And it's not just contagious for them, it's contagious for the other people that are around them, the other alumni, the advisors, the people. And I just don't know how you can't love learning when those are people you get to interact with, even if they're way earlier than you on your journey. Like this is kind of like perpetually renewing energy of, I love what I do, because in the process of continually learning myself, I get to interact with other people who they're learning things that I take for granted in my own life now. And I have to remind myself, but it's all kind of in service of helping them chart a course for their lives, of develop a positive vision for their lives. And it's something that is in short supply among young adults today, unfortunately. More and more students come out of high school, especially traditional schools, and they're just not only not sure what they want to do, but not really sure what it's all for. And there's this kind of like growing sense of nihilism. And that's a big thing we're fighting. I don't think it's like we're not political by any means. We're not on some kind of pulpit with this mission. But it is very important that the students that we work with, they are developing a positive vision for their lives. And it's not something we can give them, something that you have to develop on your own as you're learning. And you're going through that process of finding the things that really excite you in life and figuring out how to take those interests and map them onto a future for yourself. And not just your identity, not just what you do for work, but sort of like this integrated lifestyle you have that, covers these different domains of your life. So it's rewarding work. It's challenging, but I know that didn't really speak to the nuts and bolts of the program, but those, when I think about it, it's that much bigger picture thing. Like those are sort of the most important parts of it.
The positive vision for your life part's really interesting. And there's something that you just said that I think is really important. The idea that most people, like more and more young people, graduate from high school and they have no idea what they want to do, and they don't know what their sort of purpose is. And I see those two things as being, they're inextricably linked, obviously, but they're two separate problems too. And I think the first one, I actually have complicated feelings about the first one. And I want to talk to you about this because I feel like I agree that it's problematic that people have no idea what they want to do. Because if that's not treated as a temporary condition and like a thing, you don't know what you want to do, that's a temporary stage in the journey. You're going to figure it out eventually. That's a goal that you're working towards. If you treat it as such, then eventually you'll figure it out, and that's important. If you don't treat it as such, you end up in this sort of purgatory where you're just sort of stuck forever aimlessly bouncing from thing to thing and not knowing what you want to do. And that's normally not terribly constructive for ending up somewhere that you were happy to have ended up. Like if you're not aiming towards something, you're going to end up somewhere random, and somewhere random is the probability is not high that that's going to be perfectly overlapped with the things that you actually value and the things that you actually enjoy. But I also think that we put a lot of pressure on kids to haven't answered that question in a very superficial way as soon as they graduate from high school. Like the entire structure of high school is set up in this sort of very sterile, very surface level, superficial sort of like career readiness format where you take all these classes and you figure out what you're good at and what you like. It's like, well, you know, you're taking classes in all these major areas, and in some areas you're going to score higher than others, and that means you're probably good at those things. You're a STEM kid, or you're an English kid, or you're a history kid. But then you pair that with these semi-regular meetings with a guidance counselor where you talk about career readiness sort of things, and you get these very sterile and superficial quizzes to fill out and like questionnaires about what you're interested in.
Career box A.
Exactly.
You go in career box C. Yeah.
Yes. And it's like all the classes that are in purple are the ones that you should be taking because these are your strengths.
Yep.
And it's just this like very like surface layer way of thinking about, you know, a very strange sort of causality where it's like you're good at this, therefore these careers use this, therefore you should go into these careers. But it's framed in such a high stakes way.
Yeah.
Where like, okay, you discovered that you're good at these things. These are the colleges that are best for that. And you have to decide before you turn 18 or immediately upon turning 18, which one of these schools you want to go to and what you're going to major in.
Or you're going to be a loser.
And that's going to set the trajectory for the rest of your life. For the 40 years upon graduating college, you're going to do this thing for 40 plus hours a week. 52 weeks out of the year, maybe 50 weeks out of the year. I suppose you get vacation time, but you know what I mean. And that's so intimidating. There's so much pressure, but at the same time, you're never, like no one's ever sitting you down and saying, what do you value? Like not just what classes are you good at or like what aptitudes did you get on this personality test, but what are you curious about? What types of things light you up? What types of things do you enjoy doing? What comes easily to you, not just in an academic sense, but in a life sense? Like what types of ways of spending your day and what types of activities and energy expenditures make you feel energized versus make you feel super depleted? What kinds of things, you know, do you get excited about seeing shifting in the world around you that you might want to poke at and see how you can impact them? Like no one's asking you these questions, which I think is why there's such a phenomenon of, I mean, this is very, I'm scratching the surface. This is a very surface level observation, but I mean, this is part of why Jordan Peterson was such a phenomenon because he actually asked the deep questions that people felt like they'd never been asked before.
Yeah.
About like, what do you care about? His personality test is called Understand Yourself. And it's like, yes, people want to understand themselves because they don't feel like they understand themselves after taking the little worksheet questionnaire at their high school. And so there's this weird duality at play where we don't have a sense of purpose and direction, but at the same time, we're given this very superficial one that has incredibly non-superficial stakes. Like if you're $100,000 in debt for a degree for something that you thought you were going to want to do, you're pretty locked into doing that work or something else that's going to make you as much money so you can pay off the debt. Like the stakes are very high for a lifetime trajectory. And so I think we make people think that they have a long-term trajectory when maybe they don't. And we put a lot of pressure on it in ways that aren't, like it's not intended to, like pressure that it's not intended to bear and that it shouldn't be forced to bear. But I also think like it takes a while for a lot of people to figure out what they want to do. And the first 18 years of your life are not always enough prerequisite to know how you want to bend the subsequent 80.
Yep.
And I think it's really unfair to expect that of kids. Like it took me, you know, I knew I didn't want to be on the status quo path when I was 18. I had no idea what I wanted to do instead. I had no clue that I was going to be here. I didn't know 3 years ago I was going to be here. I didn't know when we were working together 4 or 5 years ago that I was going to be here. I had no clue where I was going. It took a while to figure it out. I had to live life.
Do you feel like you know what you want to do now?
Yes and no, which I think is probably the answer you expected. I have more clarity about it than I've had at any other point in my life. There's also a deep awareness that I'm going to discover a lot more things that I haven't yet even, like, it hasn't even occurred to me existed or are possible paths that are probably going to speak to me, I think. But I think to some extent, yes. I mean, I've found work that's deeply meaningful to me and that I'm good at and that, you know, seems to be replicable and that I feel like plays to my strengths and gives me a level of dynamism that I personally always knew I wanted. Like I would never be very good working for somebody else for an extended period of time. If I'm ever applying for a job in the future, which I doubt, I will not send them this podcast interview where I'm admitting all of this. But like I discovered that I really liked the entrepreneurial stuff and I really care about the education stuff. And I really like this, you know, podcasting and Twittering and writing and all of these types of things. But I didn't know that.
Yeah, but that's part of
in my early 20s. And so I think the balance of all this, like there's what you're saying is directly at odds in some ways with what the status quo path produces. And yet there are a lot of like complicated pulls that we intentionally and unintentionally and circumstantially place on young people that make this really hard.
Yeah. Well, it's absolutely unrealistic to expect an 18-year-old kid who has limited to no life experience, work experience, let alone permission. Like they haven't had permission to go out and experience the world on their own, except for, you know, in many cases underneath the thumb of a overbearing parent. Entirely unrealistic for them to expect to know what they want to do for the rest of their lives. And I also think it's just unrealistic to expect that of anybody. The world's changing. It's always been changing. It's evolving. New technology happens, and you know we're living in such a wild time now where you know technology continues to grow at a ridiculous clip. But I think the average 18-year-old in today's world feels a lot of pressures that are even bigger than when I was 18. The general trust in institutions is much lower. The general sense of confidence that following the path that everyone has always told them to follow will work out and be worth it and give them all of the alleged outputs that they feel entitled to, that's actually going to play out according to plan, that very low confidence. I think that's coupled with there are so many different things you can do today. And so it's part of this analysis paralysis problem of, you know, how could I possibly pick one thing when there are infinite things that I could be? It's this endless potential. That's a ton of pressure, let alone when you feel the pressure of everyone breathing down your neck to give them a good answer. What are you doing next fall? What are you going to do with your life? Where are you going to college? What do you want to do? What are you going to study? All of those things. That's ridiculous. I think when I say things like we help young adults figure out what they want to do, it's very different from what you might expect of an 18-year-old when you ask them what are they going to do? Do they know what they want to do? When I think about it, it's let's help you find the strongest possible starting point. You've got to start somewhere and you're going to build from there. I like to think about it as this iterative, incremental process. Even in my own career, you make the best possible hypothesis you can on the information that you have. And maybe this is where I'm stealing Jordan Peterson's fire is you reach for the noblest goal on the horizon and you take aim at that and you work towards that. And as you work toward that goal, you try to manifest this future version of yourself that you think is who you need to become or what your potential merits. Your goal is going to expand. Goalposts are going to move. You're going to find something new, either in an offshoot that you're more interested in, or you're going to find some even loftier goal that, you know, you've overcome all these obstacles on your path toward your goal and you've become stronger and smarter and more capable. And so you're now destined for a much bigger goal than you previously thought yourself incapable of chasing after. And that's all very like esoteric and lofty. But what does it mean in a practical sense is you've got to start somewhere. let's find something you're interested in. Let's help you map that interest onto an actual career path. And that may mean an actual job. It may mean some way of making an income. Maybe it's doing a freelance business of some kind with a skill that you've already begun to cultivate, but you want to develop it even further. Maybe it's finding a job where you can be exposed to that skill or that industry or that particular interest in a deeper, more meaningful way. And you can begin to build this infrastructure around that thing you're interested in. This infrastructure meaning a way to create value, actual real world life experience, work experience, a network, credibility and confidence, all of those different things that are kind of critical for you going out and encountering the world and trying to blaze a trail for yourself. I love to think about this. A few years ago, I sat down and I mapped out all the jobs that I had between, from my very first jobs all the way through my late 20s, early 30s. And I included all the things that were like informal jobs, like ways that I made money.
I remember this.
It was something ridiculous. Like it was like almost 30 jobs by the time I was like 28 or something.
You made like a graphic,
yeah,
right?
I made a graphic.
I remember this.
And I then I kind of charted it on time.
Yeah.
And charted my actual journey through this. And it was like time versus earning potential. Because I knew one of my early goals is like, I want to make a lot of money because I have all these other big goals and that's going to require capital. It's going to require all these things. And so I was kind of like trying to chart my path towards getting where I wanted to go. And it's so funny because like the first like 4 or 5 years of this was like boom, 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 boom. And then it was like this wild step back, both in terms of like immediate earning potential and like trajectory. I felt like I took like 5 steps back and kind of took this low man on the totem pole path. And then this path began to emerge. And even some of those steps weren't directly related, but a path emerged because I suddenly saw this sort of like this direction that my life was taking me and the interests were taking me. And I reached a point where it was no longer like, okay, well, I'm doing this. What if I want to do this? How do I change course? It was like, I know I can go do that. I built skills. I built confidence. But it's funny because watching that curve there was this is very much what I believe like the right way to approach education is and the right way to approach your life. And this is from the late, great Clayton Christensen. His idea of there's an emergent strategy for your life. There's a deliberate strategy for your life. Or, familiar language might be, there's kind of this explore, exploit process of learning is in the early innings before your first mission is clarity. Your first mission is like, go out and explore the unknown. You go and take this emergent strategy where you're placing different calculated bets on the things you're interested in. And some of those are going to fail. Some of those things they're not going to pan out. You're going to be like, oh, I'm not interested in that anymore. And in a way, like you're trying to narrow the playing field down. You're trying to eliminate, or, a simple way to think of this is like, don't do stuff you hate. You're trying to like take all these hypotheses you have about who you think you're supposed to be or who you want to become or what skills you want to develop or what you want your life to be. And you're exploring those in a, it doesn't even have to be strategic. You can fumble around like I did for years and years. And your path is going to merge if you keep doubling down on the things that are interesting in, and you keep like narrowing that playing field over time. And that's that emergent strategy. And then at some point, if you keep running that process, you're going to fixate on something. You're like, oh my gosh, I really like this. And this is when you can shift gears. And this is where things really become fun, is you can shift from emergent, where I would say what you're really trying to prioritize is optionality, to deliberate, where you're like, I'm going all in. This is the thing I want to go all in on. This is where I'm going to put maximum skin in the game on this thing because I have high conviction. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to develop. This is a problem worthy of my time and my intellect. I think this is part of the big problem with college, is some people are making that big all-in bet way before they've done the hard work of trying to narrow down the playing field and like make sure that they're making a really high conviction bet. And so when I think about helping people figure out what they want to do, it's that first part of the journey is, as quickly as possible, let's help you conduct this emergent process, this discovery process of exploring different horizons, narrowing down some of the things you don't want to do, and at least having a handful of things that you're like reasonably excited by. If there's one that really jumps out, let's place a little bit bigger bet there. But first and foremost, you need to get started. And you need to build momentum, and you need to build confidence, and then comes all the hard work. And actually in the real world, you need to build experience. You need to build credibility. You need to provide for yourself. So you need to build financial independence. You need to build actual autonomy in your life. So that's more than just financial independence. It's you need to become your own person. You need to develop your own ideas about the world, your own framework for navigating the world and the challenges of life. Learning how to wrestle with the big problems of like, oh, I've got these 2 jobs. Which one should I take? Well, this one pays better. I don't really want to do it. I'll feel dead inside doing it. But this one I'm really interested in. But the pay is not very good. And I have to move across the country. And how do you handle those things as a young adult? So it's conducting that career discovery process, but it's also giving young adults a template for navigating those tough things so that they can continue to work that process until they find the thing they're really high conviction about. And sometimes people do that in a quick time frame. Sometimes people do it in a couple of years. Some people like me, we're less mature and we're like way too in our heads and we take so many more twists and turns, and it takes like 10 years to finally begin to see that path emerge. But that's the necessary work that I think almost every young adult has to do at some point. And if they don't do it, like this is where you hear all the horror stories of like midlife crises and people waking up in bed one morning with cold sweats. Like, how did I get here? This is the life that I always thought, knew that I didn't want. That's how you avoid it. You do that as quickly as possible. And if possible, do that before the stakes are high. Do that when you're still living in your parents' house, rent-free, and they're like helping provide for you and they've kind of reduced that cost. Or do it right in your first step in the real world where your cost of living is low and you don't have a ton of entangling obligations like a family and kids and obligations that, while good, you got to provide. You don't have the luxury of like going and doing all these things if you're also like juggling all these other obligations. So like do that in this perfect window of time that you've been given as a young adult. It's like right at the start of your journey, because it only gets more difficult the farther along you go.
It's funny how clear that feels sitting here now versus how, specific the advice feels, but how unclear how that's going to translate feels. Like so when I graduated from high school and decided not to go to college, I ended up interning with Praxis, which is how I met you. And I found Praxis because it was the only thing I could find on the internet where people were talking about skipping college and doing something else. And like a couple of people from the founding team had dropped out of college. One of them had dropped out of an Ivy League. And they were talking about, this is why we did this, and this is what we're doing instead, and this is why this path is better. And I was like, oh, thank goodness. Like
there are other people out there.
There are at least like 5 people besides my parents who are not going to think I'm insane for doing this. And so I held on to that like a lifeline, and eventually, sent some emails. I was like, who are you guys? Like, how do I become your friend? And eventually ended up working for Praxis, where I worked for years, as you know. And so I was, deeply entrenched in this advice. Like I just like went and found the well of this and just like dropped myself in and just like soaked. I was like, I need to absorb as much of this as I possibly can, because it felt right. But it also, you don't know what you don't know when you're 18. Everything's really confusing. Even if you've been on a very non-traditional path like I had been, you're still faced with the reality of the real world, which is cold and hard. And I mean, it's also wonderful, but it's, it's real. And you have to figure out how am I going to figure this out? This is a puzzle to be solved. And I, heard people say the types of things that you are saying, and they didn't, like, conceptually they made sense, but it's like anything in life where people tell you like, oh, when this thing in your life happens, like you'll know when it happens, and then everything's different. You're like, okay, but it's an act of faith for me to believe you, because I've never experienced this myself. So I don't actually know that this is true. Yeah. I'm just choosing to believe you because I trust you as a source, because for some reason I have deemed that you are trustworthy. You have, for career advice, like maybe you're on a path that I respect and admire, and it like aligns with my values. And I think, I wouldn't be angry if I ended up in your shoes. So I'm going to take your advice on this. but it's funny to sit here and talk about it because the feeling of what that was like when I was 18 is still so real to me, where, it's like, well, you'll figure out what you want to do. And it's like, will I? I think I will, but I don't know for sure because I have yet to experience this. And now at 27, I know that what people told me was true, but it's so simple when you sit here and you talk about how to figure this out. But it's so confusing when you're just starting out in the real world and you really don't know what you're doing and you really don't know how it's all going to emerge. And I think, that's part of what I loved so much and was so grateful for from Praxis was this community of people that were able to give some grounding and some perspective to things that lend perspective to things that I hadn't yet had the chance to see firsthand. But, it also sort of gave me some structure and direction while I was figuring things out. And I think it's just funny to talk about it now. And it's just hitting me as we're having this conversation because, you have to like talk about the things again for the perspective to kick in and be like, oh yeah, that was very confusing. And people said exactly what you're saying. And I wasn't totally sure if I believed them.
Yeah.
And yet it turned out to be true. And that's such a real experience for so many people.
Yeah. It's funny for me, even sitting on this side too, especially knowing what I know now, not just running this business, having worked with thousands of young adults over the past, years of my life and career, but it's also thinking about my own journey. Is this idea, especially thinking about who I was at 18 and who the average 18-year-old is, like what's going through your head and the pressure that you're feeling is you want high confidence that everything's going to work out. You want certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And you feel all this pressure and you feel the pressure that making the wrong decision is going to be cataclysmic. And so as you're evaluating these things, you want, you're like, I got to make the right choice. I got to make the right choice. But it's just so funny to me today that people in the world we live in tend to feel almost hesitant about betting on themselves, but they feel almost so at ease about betting on institutions. Like, I want to make a really high probability bet that everything's going to work out. And so the best way I can do that is I can bet on this institution that owes me nothing and does not care about me. And that's going to spit me out and everything's going to be all right. And that's a higher probability bet than just betting on myself. And knowing that, like, if I work hard, if I'm curious, if I like seek out the right people, and if I like always keep learning, if I keep doing all those things, why does that feel like a lower probability bet?
It's wild.
It's wild, but such is life. It's
but
a problem
it doesn't have to be.
It doesn't. It's certainly a narrative that's been changing over the past decade, and it's an exciting time to be alive. It's only going to get better. More and more people are waking up to the ideas of like, you got to bet on yourself other than institutions. And that's at every rung of the ladder in the education world. Like, people are wising up, like, there are better ways.
I want to talk a little bit more about your story learning through business, because there's a lot there that we haven't unpacked yet that I think is really interesting and really juicy. You ultimately decided that you were going to go work at startups. Basically, I'm summarizing what I know about your story. You can correct me where you think I am misrepresenting this, but at least from the outside, it looked like you decided you're like, I'm going to go all in on working at startups and I'm going to learn as much as I can. And you climbed the ladder a couple of times, if I remember correctly, at different companies, working just whatever you could get your hands on, starting at the bottom and working your way up and just finding ways to be valuable and building tons of skills along the way.
Yeah.
And you got a crash course in how business works. I remember when I first met you and hearing you talk about how you thought about business, it seemed like you developed so much business acumen. Like, you were a few years ahead of where I was when we first met, and I was in my first rodeo at a startup and learning as I was going, and you'd been through it a couple of times, and hearing the way you talked about how much you'd learned about the working in a startup and how businesses work and how how like the broader like economic markets work because of the embodied experience of seeing it firsthand inside of a company, and how that shaped your philosophical thinking about not just your career trajectory, but the work that you were doing. All of that was just always so interesting to me to hear you talk about. And I want to unpack that a little bit, because I feel like there's so much that you learned that is, one, just like valuable lessons to unpack, but two, the approach that you took, I think I think it's highly replicable. If you want to understand how the real world works, go work at a startup. Like, I think that's pretty solid advice, but I want to hear you unpack some of this.
Yeah, well, you make me sound like such a nerd, and that's okay. Like, guilty as charged.
I mean this. I mean, I may have a bad radar for what sounds unflatteringly nerdy, but I mean this is the highest form of phrase. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, so I'll back up and I'll tell you a couple of like formative stories that like spurred this adventure. I told you I worked at the startup in college, and that was like an eye-opening experience. But after that, I had a couple of jobs right out of college. I worked in financial advising. I thought I was going to go do that whole thing while I saved for law school, business school, and maybe even continue to do that. I didn't really have a better path in mind, but I went through that training. I started doing that. I ended up doing that for about a year, but I hated it. I hated it because I didn't really know why I was doing it. I didn't know like why this was important. I didn't really know how I was getting better. I was developing sales skills, which, you know, a handful of my early career experiences were doing sales of different varieties. And I walked into my boss's office one day and I expressed my sort of discontent with what I was doing. And I loved the experience. It was great. It was valuable. The company, you know, reputable company, Fortune 100 company. And I told him, and he was like, "You'd be stupid to quit. Like, one, it's going to be hard for you to find another job. And two, like this is the best thing you could be doing." And I was like, so cocky. And you know, that's what you do when you're 22. And, you know, you think you've got the world by a tail, but I did. I quit. And she's like, "All right, best of luck." And so I was like, all right, I'm sweating. I got to go find a job tomorrow. And so I knew kind of like still the plan was go back to law school. And so I went back to the town where I went to college. I printed out my resume, which I thought was, you know, really nice. I thought it looked great. I thought I had all these extracurriculars and everything. I thought I looked great on paper, but I didn't really have a ton of work experience. And I printed it out in color, you know, made sure the watermark was nice. I put on my best suit, and it's August in Oklahoma. It's like 107 degrees outside. And I went to every law firm in town, and I got told no in not so many words, like 20 times. Like the first, you know, however many doors I knocked on, everybody's just like, "Get lost," you know. And the last one I knocked on, you know, you only need one person to say yes. But I walked in. They had an immediate need to fill this job because the guy was leaving, and they like just found out. So they interviewed me. I got the job. Fast forward about 6 more months down the road, and I was doing this photography thing, freelance on the side. I was making some money. It was something I was really interested in, and also like the idea of like starting my own business and learning that. And I was doing the business's bookkeeping at this law firm. I was handling phone calls. I was, you know, basically an office manager for this law firm while also being, you know, an assistant. And it was a good experience. But one day my boss brought me into his office, and he's like, "Hey, if you ever want to be a serious attorney, you need to quit screwing around with photography." And I was just like, with all due respect, sir, I quit. And I didn't have a plan again, but I knew in my bones was like, I don't know where I'm headed. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, but I know that this is wrong. I know that this is the wrong path. I know that this is the wrong person to be in proximity to, given like what I'm trying to accomplish, even if I don't have it all figured out. And, you know, turn the pages, a couple more opportunities, and I like found myself in this perfect opportunity to go apprentice the CEO of an early stage startup. Before they'd raised funding, very small team, very scrappy. Everybody's got to be pulling their weight. And this was just one of the most exciting opportunities for me early in my career. And it was the first time in my career where it was this big change from I'm running away from something to I'm running towards something. The first time in my like professional life. And part of this was I can make myself excited about this business and like what it's doing. I can see kind of the direct application and how this is useful to the customers we're serving. But really what I'm excited by is like, there's somebody here, they have what I want. They're doing what I want. And they have this energy level that's contagious. And that seems like the right person to put myself in proximity to. And I think everything else is going to work out. And it's terrifying because, I got this job. It was all the way across the country in Charleston. I was living in Oklahoma. I didn't know anybody in Charleston. I'd flown out here. Met this guy while I was out there for a different company I was working for. And I'd met this guy and I was a little bit shell shocked because he offered me the job like right at the end of our conversation. And I did a double take. I wish if I could go back, it'd have been like, hell yes, right there. I would have been like, when do I start? I'll start tomorrow. But, I was kind of hesitant. But I remember loading all of my earthly belongings in my car in Oklahoma to drive to Charleston for the first time. And part of me was a little bit scared. But as I got out on the road, I was like, this is the most peace I'd felt in my life in a long time at that point. Because I was like, all right, this is it. This is me pushing all my chips in. I'm pushing all of them in. I'm betting on myself. Like, hell or high water, I'm going to make this work. I'm not coming back to Oklahoma empty-handed. Like, I am going to go make this work. And so there's two first big lessons there. One is you've got to put yourself in proximity to somebody who you believe worthy of your respect and like worthy of like bending over backwards to help. You can't put yourself in proximity to somebody that you just know like, hey, this is not somebody I want to learn from. This is somebody whose advice is not leading me down the path I want to go down. And the second thing is like, you got to find a high conviction bet to make. And that doesn't mean you have to like be really convicted about the company or the industry, but like a high conviction bet, which is like, this is something I'm willing to bet on myself for, or this is something that like, I know this experience, I'm going to make it worth it. Even if the company ends up going under, like I'm going to make it worth it. And I'm going to get the most of this lesson that I have. And then finally, this is probably the most important thing. Everything else is a byproduct of these three things is you got to go in and you got to work your ass off. And that's so much more than just working hard. It's being the guy who is going to pick up the trash. It's being the guy who's like going to put desks together for the new office open. It's like being the guy who's going to, we had this early in that job. There was this report that had to be done every single morning by 7 a.m. Eastern, every single morning, 365 days per year, Christmas included. And I got to be the lucky one to do that. And I was like, oh, this is cool. I'm learning all this stuff about accounting and finance and like all this stuff. And, it got to the point where it became rote. And I was like, oh, I can do this better. I can do it faster. Like, okay, now I can automate parts of this. And like got to the point where, it was like a 2-hour task at first and got it down to like 12 or 15 minutes. And it was like, got to the point where it's like, this is the way I start my day. And it led me to get up earlier and earlier. And it was one of many experiences that I think that a lot of people would have stuck their nose up at something like that. And I probably was just naive. I didn't know any better. I was like, oh, this is an interesting thing. And so like, this must be an important job. They trusted it to me. Like I was telling myself these stories, but I think that was kind of the basis of this is like, I'm going to work so hard. Like I'm going to say yes to everything and I'm going to jump at every opportunity. And if you do that, even the small stuff, especially the small stuff early on, if you've done the first two things right, you've put yourself in proximity to somebody that's like the kind of person you want to follow into battle. And you've made a high conviction bet, like hell or high water. I'm going all in on this. I'm going all in on this experiment, and I'm gonna get the lesson I came here for. And then you work your ass off, and you volunteer for the little things, and you do them remarkably, and you do them without complaining, day in and day out. People are just gonna hand you cool opportunities. They're gonna be like, hey, does anybody have some bandwidth to take on this cool thing? And you're gonna say yes, and you're gonna do it. And you probably don't know how to do it, but you're gonna figure it out, and then you're gonna do it, and you're gonna learn it, and you're gonna expand your skill set. And guess what? Next time, a little bit more important job's going to come along and you're going to be the first person that comes to mind. And if you do that over and over and over again, like it's remarkable how easy it is to win at your career if that's a mindset you take. And again, like I'm not going to pat myself on the back and say I had this like grand plan. It was just like accidentally doing these things because I was naive. I didn't know any better and it was interesting at the time. And I didn't have anything else better to do. I moved to a town across the country. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have a social life. I didn't have anything else to do. What was I going to go do? Sit at home alone at night? It's like, I'd rather be working. And so if you can find that type of opportunity, not just like moving across the country, but if you can find the right opportunity where you can put yourself into proximity to somebody, you can make a high conviction bet and you can work really, really hard. A lot of the rest of the stuff is just like figuring out skills you need to build that are relevant to like the path you're trying to take. Trying to maneuver yourself into a position like in the right company where, there's upward trajectory over time. But all of those are byproducts of those first big three things.
Mm-hmm.
And learning about business itself, like that's half of it. Like you got to work really hard. You got to deliver. You got to be reliable to not just your coworkers, but to your customers. And there's a lot more like hard business lessons behind that. But that was sort of what opened the whole door for me.
There's a lot that we can dig into with all of this, but I want to talk a little bit about, I want to come back to Praxis again, because I know that there are a lot of parents who listen to this who, even in the early stages of parenthood, are thinking about, okay, if the status quo path isn't making sense, like we're practically deciding in the present tense that we're not going to be following it, then it begs the question, what about all the other status quo things that you're supposed to do farther along the path, like college? But there are also a lot of parents who listen to this who have kids in high school and who have kids who are approaching that college epoch where, traditionally it's the college era of your life and you have to figure out, what are we doing about this transitionary period between being a child and being an adult, where usually college picks up the slack, even if it doesn't do a very good job of it. And so for parents who are thinking through all of this, I'd love to have you tell them a little bit about what you are doing at Praxis and you talked on a philosophical level about what it looks like, but a little bit practically about what you guys offer, what it looks like, how you're working with young people, and also where people can learn more about what you're doing. Yeah,
they should check out discoverpraxis.com. They can learn more about the program. There's a guide there. They could schedule a call with the team to learn more, but practically speaking, it runs a full academic year. You go through our program, which is designed to help teach life skills, career skills, foundational professional skills, and hard skills. But the underpinnings of this is like helping you chart a course or build a roadmap for your early career. So it's, what skills am I interested in? How does that map onto the actual career landscape? What are the types of jobs? What do those jobs look like? What do they look like in different industries, different companies, all of those kind of things. But it's not just like book knowledge or like you're learning.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is through project-based learning. It's through tight feedback loops with peers, with advisors. It's professional workshops, things where you're actually getting high fidelity information about the thing you're trying to learn. You're not just listening to a lecture. Like you're interacting, you're engaging on live workshops. You're asking questions to people who are doing the thing you're interested in, or professionals. We're helping you build your network through that as well. And part of that process of building your network is exposing you to multiple case studies about like people who've taken different routes to the thing you're trying to do. And part of that is, we're going to introduce you to people. Part of it is like teaching you how to build your network intentionally. And then it's how to actually go take all these things you learn and like create opportunities for yourself in the real world. How to actually go from, hey, I have this skill, I have this thing I'm interested in. How do I make a career out of this? How do I actually go get hired? How do I go convince somebody to give me money for the thing that I want to do for them, or the problem that I know how to solve? And there's a lot that goes into that. The hard skills are important, but as important as all the hard skills is the mindset you build, which is this idea of like value creation, this idea of learning as this continuous process, and loving to learn because, it's something that is an end unto itself. It's something that's rewarding, but also as this way to more predictably get the results out of life that you want. And that's a really valuable mindset. It's something that, certainly lacking in most schools, but it's that combination of mindset, hard skills, and a success framework for your early career that you walk out of the program with more confidence, more clarity about what you want to do, and hopefully a running start in the direction that you want to go.
Are there specific, I don't know if case studies is quite the right word, but like, because all this makes sense in theory, I think it resonates on an intuitive level for people, but I think it can be hard to like map that onto real world trajectories.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have examples or like specific scenarios that you can talk through a little bit, just to kind of like, because I think this applies in so many different arenas to so many different career paths and areas of interest. But I think those specific examples can be super, super helpful for understanding and practice. Oh, this is how I might map this onto like my kid's interest and my kid's trajectory. Can you talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll paint some broad strokes here, but there are actual tangible, like full length interviews with alumni on the website. So check those out too. If you're a parent, you're interested, and like listen to people's actual stories, what they were doing before, why they were not interested in going to college, what they were trying to accomplish, how they did that, what their program experience was like, what their first few, 4 days into the real world were like. Some of the things that I love is just like the freedom and optionality that young adults have on the other side of our program. I can't tell you how many people can't legally order a beer in the United States, but they're making six figures and have several rental properties, and they have like total freedom over whatever they want to do with the rest of their life because they like won the game so early. And maybe they want to take their career in a different direction after a handful of years because they get some experience, but they're more equipped to do that. They've built a life experience. They built the credibility. They built the actual hard skill set. They have the right mindset. They know how to create value, and they've de-risked that transition. So those are some of the mechanics of like what I think like a great outcome is you've figured out some skill that you've developed remarkably well. You've gone and gotten some real world experience. So, everything within the business world is like kind of our sweet spot. Some popular areas like sales, marketing, working behind the scenes in a business, whether you're like helping customers or like actually in the like operations administration side. But you don't have to be like an aspiring entrepreneur. A lot of our students happen to be. You can be an aspiring creative, whatever that means for you, an artist, writer, videographer, photographer. Like the important things that you need to learn are, one, you need to continue to build skills, but two, you need to learn how to create value, how to apply leverage with the things that you're interested in, the skills you're developing, how to solve problems for other people. And that seems like it's somewhat fluffy, but it's like there's mechanics to that. There's a way to be better about packaging a pitch to convince somebody that like, hey, not only do I have the skill, but I'm going to deliver on my word. I'm capable of doing the thing that I claim to do. And then there's some salesmanship you got to learn with that. But that's not just applicable to a path in sales. Like every young adult, no matter what they're interested in doing, they need to learn how to win opportunities for themselves. They need to know how to get their first job, how to get promoted, how to change jobs, how to convince somebody to hire them. So that's like part of the foundational skills alongside with hard career skills that they're going to learn. When I think about some of my favorite success stories, I mean they're more than I can count, but I think of the young adults. Like I think of a homeschooler who moved across the country to get an early stage marketing job and published a couple books before she was even 20 and had multiple jobs, literally 4 job offers within the next week when she decided to change jobs. And she had total freedom and optionality over her life and career. Like she had total ownership of the direction she's going to take her life because she focused on doing the right things first. Or I think about another high school dropout who did the program. Got an early job in sales, did really well, learned how to do it, got another job, continued to grow, continued to get promoted, continued to make more money, started buying rental properties on the side, moved into real estate, parlayed that to go work at a real estate marketing agency. And it was like, it was no longer like most of our students, one of the common themes is they no longer are like hoping somebody invites them to the big dance. They're like deliberately choosing their path through their careers. And that's such a different way of going about your life and career than the average person coming out of college, especially if student debt's involved. And so when you factor in like, hey, here's the framework we're trying to help you build through the program, but we're also going to help you build financial independence and like get a running start financially where you're going to actually make good money while you figure out a lot of these things, while you're trying to develop clarity about what you want to do longer term. The sky's the limit. I think that I'll say one final thing about this is that I think the wrong way to think about the program is outcomes focused. Hey, what job can you help me get? It's less about that. Like in many cases, that's the easiest part of the problem to solve. It's what do I want to do? What have the most successful people done to get there? What are the skills I need to build? What are the experiences I need to build? It's like all of that hard work at the front is like gaining clarity about the bet you want to take, the bet you want to make about the skills you want to build, the direction you want to take your life. We can help people work towards almost any goal, practically speaking. But really, we want to work with the students who are willing to put in all that hard work, not just take the easy way out of like going and getting a degree and like hoping that that degree is the golden ticket. Like if you're willing to work hard and you're curious, you're coachable and you have high character, like you could be successful in any walk of life without college, without our program even. Like go do that. But those are the people that I get excited about working with and helping them get there faster.
If people enjoyed this conversation, you mentioned discoverpraxis.com for finding out more about the program. Are there other places where people can also find more of your work specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm on Quora, I'm on Medium, I'm on Twitter. Go to our website. There's a link at the top called The Playbook, twice per week newsletter about education, career, money, specifically aimed at young adults. Parents like it as well. Definitely check that out. Very accessible over email, mitchell@discoverpraxis.com. Would love to, answer any questions you have. One final note on this is, if there's anybody listening that's interested in praxis, maybe not for a student or young adult in your life, but just genuinely interested in the ideas of the program, I'm happy to talk to you as well. But, another way that you can help is fund a scholarship for a student. Go to discoverpraxis.com/give. You can make a donation to the foundation. You can fund scholarships for students. Some of these people who are trying to take an alternate route, and they're trying to, build something better for themselves. Like that's a tangible way that people can help out as well.
I love that. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. This was really fun.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure, Hannah. Thanks for putting this on.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right, that's a wrap for this week. Thank you so much for being here. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, please leave a 5-star rating. Ratings are how this show gets discovered by other people, and it helps me bring in better guests. And no matter where you're listening, please like and subscribe to the show to make sure you don't miss a future episode. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next week.